Hello, guys. This is Mr. Cole coming to you live from my apartment as we continue on teaching about our measurements of an economy. So far, where we've been, we've talked about GDP. Obviously, that's kind of like the central measurement of how the economy is doing. We've also talked about the unemployment rate and how the unemployment rate kind of gives that GDP kind of the personal measurement of how are actual individual people doing. So following with that same trend of kind of how individual people are doing, it is important to look at a measurement of poverty and measure. Of course, if the economy is not doing very well, there's going to be more people living in poverty. If the economy is doing well, there's going to be less people living in poverty. Um, so with this, some of our guidelines, so this is a little bit old, but basically the way the poverty rate is determined is they take the size of your family and they divide it by your annual income, basically. Okay, and so the bigger the family that you have, the higher the amount needs to be to clear the poverty rate. Now, the way that they come up with it is they actually take whatever the price for a diet is, okay, for a healthy, diet that can sustain you. They multiply that number times three. They take the cost of a yearly diet, multiply it times three, and that's the number that comes up with what the annual poverty rate is. Okay, so you can see here the larger the family size, the more income that is needed. With that, you can see the general poverty rate over time. You can see the 1950s and 60s, we had much more poverty, but the implementation of a lot of anti-poverty programs have really brought that number down to being a steady about 15% of our population living underneath the poverty line. Now, with that, there have been some other measurements because, of course, food is not the only thing that you have to buy. And so there's been other measurements that have been added, which might indicate the poverty rate in the United States is actually higher than this number is. But that's the general acceptance for what makes that a person living in poverty. Now, some of the factors, and I just go through this really quickly. I mean, obviously, none of this is set for everybody, but just generally speaking, of course, the higher level of education that you have, the less likely nationwide to fall into poverty. Unfortunately, based on the racial injustices in our country, as well as injustice based on your sex, is going to lead, traditionally women are more likely to live in poverty than men. Things like your race, minority races, are more likely to live in poverty than white people are. That's just nationwide statistics. Demographic trends, things like divorce, things like teenage pregnancy or single mothers, also more likely to end up living in poverty in those situations. Along with this, the way that the economy is changing, low skilled service workers are going to more likely to suffer the effects of poverty than folks in high skilled, high needed jobs. Okay. Now, with that, in terms of the United States actually has a pretty high income inequality for being a pretty advanced nation compared to a lot of the similar first world nations. We have one of the higher inequalities, meaning that we have a lot of really rich people, but we also have a decent amount of poverty for our country. Now, this is graphed in something called the Lorenz curve. And this is what I want to show you today. It's basically how we plot our equality of income by any sort of country. And we can compare two countries. So in the United States, our lowest 20% of our population, so our poorest 20% of our population, receives only about 3.4% of our nation's wealth. Okay? However, our highest 20% receives 50% of our nation's income. Now, this is not shocking. We are a capitalist country. We are a market economy, right? And so the government doesn't necessarily jump in to try and necessarily fix that all the time. If you guys could give me a second, I want to pause this. I'm going to flip it around on my tablet here real fast so that I can draw up on this, and we'll get going in a second. Here we go. Alrighty, I'm back. My voice might have changed because I'm now on the tablet mode of this. So what the Lorenz curve shows is this income inequality that a nation has. So basically the Lorenz curve is actually just two lines, okay? The first line, this one right here, let's see if I have some sort of highlighter. This line right here is the line of perfect equality. It is the perfect dream world that doesn't exist. What it shows is that each segment of the population receives the same amount of income. So here we go. 20%, the bottom 20% of the population receives 20% of the cumulative income of the country. The bottom 40% of the population receives 40% of the income. Okay? And if we kept doing this, the 80% would have 80% of the population. And of course, the Lorenz curve will always end in the same spot, with 100% of the population, everybody in the country, would receive 100% of the wealth. Okay, this is the perfect kind of dream world where every single person in the country makes exactly the same amount of money. Of course, we know that is not possible. Okay? All right. So with this, the second graph, this one right here, the bowed one, is really the graph that shows what actually is happening in the country. Okay? So when we look at this, okay, of course, 0% of the population receives 0% of the income. But let's see what happens to 20% of the population. 20% of the population only receives 5% of the income. So the poorest 20% only make 5% of the income. Okay? Compare that to the richest 20%. Okay? 80% is here. Okay? So 80% of the population, right? The poorest 80%, all of this, all of that stuff, all those people, total, added all together, make up only 55% of the income. Meaning, these guys right here, in the richest 20% of the population, these guys alone account for this whole amount of total, which is 45, oops, did not draw that well, 45% of the income. So the richest 20% of the country, this segment right here, accounts for nearly 45% of the population, of the income. However, go down here and look at your poorest 20. Your poorest 20 right here, they only accounted for 5% of the income. Meanwhile, the richest 20 equal 45% of the income. Okay? So the graph gets a little bit tricky because with it uses cumulative data, right? So you got to be very careful, right? So let's say, for example, that I wanted to measure the middle 20%, between 20 and 40% of the population, okay? This would be your lower middle class people. How much do they make of the income? So what I would need to do is I would need to look at the one before it. So the one before it, the bottom 20%, they make 5% of the income, okay? Well, from here I look at the 40%. The next 20, the next jump, the next group of people, they make 10% of the income. Here's the tricky part. This 40% right here also includes the 20% that we already calculated. Meaning that from this jump to this jump, from 20 to 40, only added 5% of the income. So how much income does this group bring? This group brings in 5% of the nation's income, right? Also, not a whole lot, okay? So it gets really tricky because you have to draw the lines on the graph to analyze it. So let's get a fresh graph here, and we'll look at the United States' actual one. Oops. Scroll down. Alrighty, so here's the United States one, okay? So let's see what the richest 20% in our country make, and we'll use the 2014 line. So to figure this out, okay, we're going to look at the richest 20% of the population. That is right there, between 80 and 100. So if we draw up to 80. All right? So 80% of our nation's population makes 50% of the income. That includes all of these folks right here are all included in this. Okay? So all those folks, our poorest and our middle class, only make 50% of the nation's income. The richest 20%, the group just from right here, ends up making the next 50% is all made by the richest 20. Right? That's a lot, right? 50% of the wealth is controlled by 20% of the people. That is not very equal. Okay? Now let's look at what the poorest 20% in our country are making. Okay? The poorest 20% in our country, 20 to there, okay, they make only about 5% or so of the population, right? They are of the income. Right? You can do the same thing. You look about the 40%. They only add about 7%. The next 20, now we're talking the middle class, only controls about 30% of the wealth. Right? So you can see the majority of the wealth in our country are held by our richest 20% of our country. Now, the other big thing that you can do with this is we can compare two nations. So let's compare what USA's graph looks like with China's. Okay? And it's hard because I can't get it side by side. But you can see that China has a more unequal income. That is because their line is further away from this perfect equality line. Okay? So when you look at this, if you look at the richest 20% for China, the richest 20% for China controls about, 55% of the wealth, right? From 45 to 100, about 55%. So China is slightly more unequal than the United States is. Again, it's hard to tell since I can't be flipping back picture to picture to get a full idea. But the point being that when you look at that richest 20%, China citizens own more. I'm going to pause it here for a sec. All right, we're back over here. So what this Lorenz curve shows us is this inequality, right? You can see because China's line is further away from the perfect equality line, it shows that they are more unequal. Now, this I'm going to go through really quick because it's not really going to be much on your notes. We'll talk about these more later on. But our government does have assistance programs to try and offset some of this inequality. So Social Security is a government program to pay for benefits to retired citizens or people who are disabled and cannot work anymore. Medicare is health insurance for senior citizens, right? So for people who aren't working, so medical insurance. Medicaid is medical insurance for those who are needy. And these all come from our taxes as workers, right? We also have unemployment benefits for people who have lost their jobs. The government will help pay for a set amount of time, along with various welfare programs that you guys are probably aware of. Things like food stamps, things like other food and nutrition programs that help offset some of this inequality in the country. Okay, so you guys work with me to do a Lorenz curve problems and check it out. It'll be a little bit easier, I think, when you actually can dig into actually working on that. So with that, great job today, and I'll see you guys later.